Good morning, everyone. This is Manjinder from UFI. Welcome to our webinar on games and gamification. If you have any issues with audio or any other questions, do let us know in the questions box. You are all muted and you should be able to see Daniel's screen at the moment. If you've got any technical questions or issues, do ask the questions in the questions box, but there is also a handout in the handout section as well. We've got quite a large audience and we'll try and get back to you as soon as we can in the questions. So now, without further delay, I'm going to hand over to Daniel Whiston.
Thank you, Manjinder. Good morning, everybody. Hello and welcome to this webinar on games and gamification for vocational learners. Oh, 1 second. Manjinder, I can hear myself echoing. I don't know if my voice is echoing for anybody else.
Do you want to try again?
Okay, can you hear me now? Still echoing at my end. If it sounds okay to you, then we can press on with that.
Right. It's a little bit quiet. So I'm just going to, hi Daniel. Sorry guys, we're just going to sort out the sound. It was working a little while ago, so. Daniel, you're muted on both of your addresses. So on one of them, you're going to need to unmute yourself, if it's all possible.
Yes, sorry everyone. Manjinder, you or somebody else has muted me on the Yahoo one. I haven't muted myself.
Rightio, let's have a look at that.
Manjinder, you muted and then unmuted me again on Yahoo. So just unmute.
Yes, I am trying. Just give me 1 second. It's for some reason it's saying that it's self-muted on both of them. And this is what happens, guys, in live webinars when everything was working half an hour ago. And now we've got just a couple of issues. Please bear with us. My apologies for this. Yeah, Daniel, it's saying that it's...
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. But
okay, don't touch anything, Manjinder. Just put it down. Okay, everyone. Hello again. Welcome to this webinar on games and gamification for vocational learners. Before we get started, I wanted to cover a few basics just to pick up from where Manjinder introduced it. As she said, please remember that you can post your questions into the question box throughout, and the team will try to answer them as we go. But please be patient because there are a few of you here today. And also, as we've discovered, you can't use audio. Hopefully, I can use audio. Everyone else should be muted except me as the presenter. And in terms of what today is all about in a general sense, the aim of this webinar is to support practical delivery of gamified learning content. So as part of that, my focus is going to be very much on practical things rather than theory. And I'm going to try to start right at the beginning without assuming any prior knowledge on your part. So hopefully that will work out for everyone. Now, I know that there's likely to be a wide spread of experience amongst you, but hopefully by the end of this session, you'll all feel better prepared to do 3 key things. Number 1, assess whether it's pure digital games or alternatively gamification elements that are most appropriate for your project. Number 2, you'll be able to select the correct games approach for your content and for your users. And number 3, hopefully, you'll be able to better placed to design or specify a game that has an increased chance of successfully addressing the vocational problem that you're trying to solve. Now, I won't always be addressing these 3 points directly, but they should hopefully run through everything that I do talk about. And that's something that we can pick up again at the end of the session. So who am I to be saying all these things? Well, My name is Dan Whiston, and I'm a learning designer who has written a number of games over the years for children and adults, although it hasn't always been the main focus of my work. By writing a game, I mean that I've been part of a team that has produced an online digital game for learning purposes. My role has been like the scriptwriter for a movie, which other people then use to build the actual game itself. So, for example, as you can see on screen now, that's included historical games for children written for the BBC, like entries in the Dig It Up archaeology series, as well as more serious games for adult learners. In the example you can see on screen, there was a game, for example, that I wrote covering corporate values and team behavior for vocational learners in a Middle Eastern energy company for Game On. Okay, so let's look at what we're going to cover today. In this webinar, we're going to cover how gaming approaches can be used in digital learning. For the purposes of today, I'm going to break that down into 7 areas. First off, I want to distinguish between games and gamification, which are not the same thing. In essence, there are elements you can take from pure games and then reuse in a variety of different contexts without going all the way and making a full-blooded game. Having done that, we'll look at how games are used in online learning, focusing on some examples of Voctec games from the UFI family, including an extended look at Chomp, a Voctek game that I recently project managed. I'll then also touch on how you might want to approach developing or commissioning a learning game of your own. We'll then look at how gamification approaches can be detached from pure games to help you engage learners before concluding with a quick look at some possible resources. Okay, so it's almost time to get started with all of that, but before we do, let's have a quick poll. Bear with me for a moment. Okay, so how often do you play games on your phone or a games console? I'll give everyone a few more seconds to answer that. Okay, so now that the results are in with almost 2/3 of you having voted, it looks like the majority respondents, 45%, rarely play a game. 23% of you never play at all, but 3% of you are playing one right now. I wish the poll could be flexible enough to find out what that game is, but it doesn't say. Okay, well, I don't play games as often as I'd like, but I do dip in now and then. Fruit Ninja and Angry Birds were the ones I most enjoyed over the past few years. But if you're going to be involved in a gaming project, it would be a very good idea to play a few games to get into the right mindset and also to refresh your familiarity with how games work. So I'm going to close the poll now. Okay, so let's get started by looking at the difference between games and gamification. Whether you're talking about card games, board games, playground games, or digital games, the latter of which is our focus today, games are structured activities that people engage with in order to have fun. Again, in a digital context, that might mean anything from Pac-Man to Space Invaders to PUBG to Grand Theft Auto and a million other examples. Literally, I Google this before the webinar, and apparently there are over 1 million games online or on apps, which is quite a staggering achievement. So although we all play different games, we will share an understanding of what a game is based on our personal life experience. But gamification is distinct from that. What you might call pure games contain elements that are intrinsic to them, like points and high scores, but these can be detached and used in other kinds of interactive experiences like e-learning modules or webinars. So you can use game elements in learning products to achieve some of the benefits of games, like engagement, without necessarily producing an actual game. Now, this is something that we'll return to later. Okay, let's take a look at pure games. When you say online game to someone, they'll probably think of something like Halo, Grand Theft Auto, Angry Birds, Call of Duty, Candy Crush, or something like that. either a fully immersive games console experience or an addictive phone-based minigame. Either way, entertainment is to the forefront for a commercial game, and they often have huge budgets, polished visual designs, and enable hours or even days of gameplay. So first off, that might feel potentially intimidating. How can we hope to match something like that? Well, it's probably best to start by being clear with yourself and your stakeholders that you're not aspiring to produce something on par with the forefront of commercial gaming. But no one aspires to be average, so be clear on what you are trying to achieve for your learners in terms of vocational change, and then work backwards from there to produce something really targeted and effective. This could result in a simple game that runs over a Zoom call based around basic text and image resources and verbal quiz questions. If that works for you and your learners, you could basically produce it for free, time aside, and get going later this afternoon, which would be quite a result for you and your learners. But the focus of this webinar is going to be online digital games. Now, this could mean a mini game provided on a phone through an app, or it could be something else. Online digital learning games come in many, many forms. You can have what are basically quizzes with a game flavor and design, for example, with a fruit machine interface. You can have interactive films with branching decision points, where the player decides what to do next and scores points accordingly. You can have simulations based around virtual environments, treasure hunts around ancient cities. Given time and budget, the possibilities are endless. So let's focus in on some actual Voctec examples of digital games. Let's start by taking a step back. If you're producing a Voctec learning game, you want to bring about vocational outcomes in your players. So be clear about what these are and choose your game solution accordingly. The thing to avoid is what you might call chocolate-covered broccoli. This means avoiding trying to shove together two very disparate elements to make something unappealing. For example, if you want to teach learners about the GDPR, having a platform game where learners kill aliens every time they answer a quiz question correctly might look fun, but the gameplay has nothing to do with the learning content, so it might instead come across as being a fake, inauthentic experience that will annoy learners instead of engaging them. So I'd suggest that form and function should reflect each other, particularly if you have a well-developed virtual world, storyline, graphical interface, or set of characters. So for example, if your learners need to learn about how to manage teams, a sim game in a virtual office could potentially work really well. Or if you want dental technicians to remember what different teeth are called, Simon Says memory game could work. This is the approach that Chomp took, which we'll be looking at soon. So ultimately, it's all about matching the game to your learners, which makes user profiling vital. Who are your learners specifically? What are their tastes, their educational levels, the use conditions they'll be playing in? What will motivate them? And what kind of games might appeal to them? For example, you may be aiming at adult learners who are often excluded socially, perhaps with a lack of formal education, but who are comfortable with smartphones. In that situation, you may want to explore developing app-based mini-games that are quick to play, very intuitive, lots of fun, and which wear their learning lightly rather than being overly dense and formal. Sarah, any questions at this stage?
Hi, Daniel. Sarah's not joined us yet.
Okay, Manjinder, any questions?
No questions as of yet.
Okay, well, we'll pick it up later on then. Thanks very much. Okay, then let's move on to look at some UFI funded examples of actual Voctec games. So as you can see here, the British Hospitality Association produced a mobile game for 18 to 24-year-olds on cross-contamination and hygiene. Below that, National Numeracy's Stardash Studios is a mobile game to help 16 to 25-year-olds improve their numeracy. Wordable from Playlingo is a social English vocab game where players battle to show who knows their vocab best. And Applio used games-based learning to enhance professional skills like communication and problem solving. And here we have Desk, who produced Signs of Life. This is a mobile game that trains nurses and carers to spot, communicate and prioritize medical symptom updates in real time. Okay, now it's time for another poll. We just looked at some actual Voctec games. So which of the three listed here do you think you would most like to play? Okay, the votes are shooting up. Even more of you are voting this time than last time, which is great. I'll just give it a few more seconds to see if anybody else wants to take part. Okay, so in reverse order, bronze goes to Stardust Studios with the maths, silver is Desk with medical skills, and out on top, far and above in the lead with 55% of you playing, in theory, would be Wordable, which was the English game. And that would probably be my pick too, on the basis that my vocabulary is reasonably strong, so I think I'd be most likely to win. And also the star emoji did look super cute. But to be clear, in reality, they're all very much worth a look. Okay, I'm going to close the poll now. Right, okay, so following on from the examples we just looked at, let's look at the UFI case study of Chomp in a bit more detail. Blue Flame are an established games company who received a grant to make Chomp. In their own words, Chomp, quote, contains a suite of vocational training games for dental nurse training, delivering content through game mechanics to teach concepts in a more digestible manner rather than traditional training. Through the power of play, the trainees will be exposed to mini games, interacting with mouth environments and charting terminology. By having fun, learners will enjoy failing fast and being rewarded for improving their skills through level progression. Chomp took a Simon Says approach. So a mouth region or tooth will be communicated to the user, and the user or player taps the correct response. So here, form and function, or learning content and game mechanics, match very well. Initially, the levels were quite long, and the player's motivation was to beat their own score. However, through a fortuitous meeting with a former Candy Crush designer, and Candy Crush are the people who have made such an impact on mobile gaming, Chomp made a big discovery mid-project. Again, in their own words, quote, instead of having 4 long levels, we actually spread the learning content over 200 short, sharp levels. It turns out that in the Western world, mobile gamers are more motivated by progress than by trying to beat their existing scores, which makes sense. With shorter levels of 30 to 60 seconds, the user is rewarded more frequently and is always moving forwards. So we applied this approach to all of the learning modules. We could see straight away from watching testers play the impact that it made. The better we engage them, the more fun they'll have, the more knowledge they'll learn and retain. It also allowed us to assess people's progress. The further they got through the levels meant that their knowledge was being retained and they were speeding up. So what did Chomp learn from piloting with actual learners? Again, in their own words, quote, the data shows where players failed, that where they failed, 94.37% of the time, they came back to beat that level, demonstrating that players improved their knowledge or speed to progress. In the final pilot feedback, users declared if they felt they'd improved knowledge, increased speed, or gained confidence after playing Chomp. 72% felt that there was an increase of knowledge, and 70% felt an increase in speed at work-related tasks. Increase of knowledge and higher speed of recall for nurses ensures a smoother relationship with dentists and better performance at practical tasks in appointments. This reduces mistakes and allows the dentist to focus on key tasks. Okay, let's change gears. So assuming that you do want to produce a digital game for your learners, how should you go about it? Well, that's a big subject, so I'm going to take a high-level approach. Start by deciding whether you're going to develop it yourself or partner with a specialist games provider. If you want to do it yourself, there are lots of software options. I have to be clear that I'm not an expert on them. I'm basically a scriptwriter. But to pick one example, Articulate Storyline, the popular e-learning authoring tool, allows you to build games, and many, many other options exist. So if you do want to do that, and you aren't already a games developer, you might have to hire a specialist freelancer, but the barrier to entry here is reasonably low. It doesn't have to be complex, and it doesn't have to be expensive, at least in terms of developing a basic digital game. The alternative is to partner with a specialist games company. There are plenty of those, and if money is no object, you can have any kind of game you want. In the real world, money will be an object. You'll also want to ensure that the vocational learning outcomes you want to achieve will be a central and effective part of the game, and you want to avoid the chocolate broccoli effect. Will the game resonate with the specific learners you want to play it through an effective marriage of gameplay and learning content? So whether you're building it yourself or commissioning someone else, you need to keep control at every stage. One way to do that is to write a proper game design document before you build anything. Think of the games design document as a blueprint for your game. It doesn't need to be hundreds of pages long, but it should cover things in sufficient detail, including key areas like design approach. How does the nature of gameplay relate to the underlying knowledge components? Similar games and inspiration. Is it a bit like Monopoly, The Sims, Twister, Postman Pat for bricklayers? What's the basic gameplay and narrative concept here? Game world. What's the basic premise? Is there a story? What character perspective does the player take? Camera and interface. What's the player's point of view? What can they see? Do they need a heads-up display for controls and points, etc.? Gameplay and mechanics. How does the game work? How do players navigate and progress through it? How do the levels work? Then assets. What kind of art and audio resources are required? Rewards and points. How do players score? Metrics. What kind of data do you need to generate? For example, time spent playing. And learning material. This is a Voctec game, so that means you need to identify the learning content that the game needs to cover. So, whether you're developing a game yourself or working with an external partner, having a games design document will put you in a much better position to succeed. And once you've drafted one, make sure you test your ideas and assumptions with critical friends, users, and perhaps even an industry expert. Okay, time for the third poll. Having looked at what a game design document is, how likely would you be to write one if you have a games project in future? Okay, going to give it a little bit longer to give everyone a chance to vote. I think just another 10 seconds or so. Okay, brilliant, thanks. Okay, so lots of people have voted now, and it's reassuring to see that a majority of those who voted, 55%, would be very likely to use one. Although, good luck to those on 16% who think it's very unlikely, they prefer to improvise. Spread of results, which is fine, but I do think, based on personal experience, that the more time you take to produce a plan at the beginning, the greater your chance of success will be. Okay, I'm going to close that poll now. Okay, but if you don't want to make a pure game, as we've already established, there are some gamification approaches that can be detached from pure games to help you engage learners. Examples include things like points and rewards, scores and leaderboards, personalized content, and decision points with branching consequences. You can use these game elements in order to achieve some of the benefits of games without necessarily producing a game itself. So these benefits include things like engagement, motivation, exploration, practice, learning by doing, simulation in a safe environment, and competition between learners. To take just one example, you could produce an e-learning module with lots of interactive scenarios asking learners to make decisions, possibly to create solutions in situations of real-world complexity. These might be based around extended case study storylines with branching pathways through them as learners take a series of nested decisions. Feedback and points could be associated with those. There's no game as such in that situation, but many of the potential benefits would be the same, and the development and design costs would be potentially much lower. Narrative, stories and characters are also elements that can be detached from games. UFI's Readable project is based around chat fiction to teach learners English. It has very strong stories and visuals, and Netflix designed to its homepage and personalization features. Opening it up, you might assume it's a game the first time you see it, but it has no play elements. It is, however, very entertaining and engaging, which is what all games strive to be. Okay, let's finish up by looking at some resources, starting with commercial organizations. So there are many commercial organizations that could develop a game for you. They also provide blogs and advice on good practice. Growth Engineering are a large player in this space in the UK at the moment. They clearly have a commercial agenda of their own, but also a deep expertise. Totem are also a major learning games provider in what is sometimes called the serious games space. And of course, there are games agencies who have received UFI grants in the past to produce Voctec games, such as Applio and Blue Flame, who you could also potentially contact. If you want to hire specialists to work with your team, then I believe that Jampan, who are a digital learning recruitment agency, may well have game specialists on their books. And you can also get insights and articles in this space from sites like Gamified. Okay, we've covered a lot of ground today. In terms of a quick summary, I'd like to return to the 3 key points that I identified at the start. Number 1, assess whether it's pure digital games or alternatively gamification elements that are most appropriate for your project. This is all about users and your learning content. Are your users going to be very motivated and engaged by a pure game? Would your learning content fit a game well? If so, then go for it. But if not, or if you face resource constraints, then perhaps you should instead detach some game elements to use in another, perhaps simpler resource. Number 2, select the correct games approach for your content and users. Okay, so if you are going to make a game, great. But I think that sympathetically matching form and function or content and gameplay are the key elements here. So avoid chocolate-coated broccoli. To do that, accurately profiling your users is a key element. Then number 3, being able to design or specify a game that has an increased chance of successfully addressing the vocational problem you're trying to solve. So A, keeping control of the design and development process is key here. B, whether you're developing it yourself or using a partner, write and test a proper games design document. That will help to ensure that vocational learning outcomes remain essential and hopefully effective part of your game. Now, we're about to move on to questions, but before we do, I wanted to quickly address a specific question I was asked by someone when I was seeking inputs in how to shape this webinar. That person said, quote, "We support companies with taking events that would have been live online. Virtual events benefit greatly from gamification, but this could be seen as unprofessional or unnecessary. Any tips on how to sell it to clients?" Now, whether you are a company or you are an FE college or you are an independent trainer, you may still be required to sell gamification to your stakeholders, to your clients, or even to your learners. Now, I have to be upfront and say that I'm not someone who works at the sales and marketing and comms end of the process, who rolls it out. But I did think about that, and 2 elements occurred, 2 thoughts in terms of how you might make the case for the value of a games-based learning experience. First, you might want to do some quick web research for some academic literature backing up the value of learning games. There's plenty of it out there, and a few credible statistics, might well bolster your case. Secondly, it might be worth citing commercial statistics as well. For example, for the past 10 years, the video game industry in general has earned much more money than Hollywood and the music industry combined, and that's every year for the past decade. According to a recent report from an industry analyst firm called Matari, the value of the global game-based learning industry will amount to over $17 billion by 2023. So it's hardly a marginal activity anymore. Okay, well, that's the end of the core part of the presentation. Manjinder, do we have any questions?
Hi, Dan. Yes, we do have some questions now. Right, there's lots actually, so I'm just going to try and go through all of these. There's lots of comments and questions coming through.
Be kind to me and pick the easiest one first.
Right, let's have a look. So Samuel Hilton has asked, well, he said that he's not that clear on the difference between games and gamification.
Okay, good question. So for me, a game is something which has fun and play at the forefront. There's, as I said at one point, there's a million different games you can play digitally. So there's always examples like, war games, games with fruit slices, Candy Crush, Monopoly, a board game, something where play and fun is at the forefront, where you're supposed to enjoy it first and foremost. But there are mechanics that underlie that gaming experience, like scoring points, for example. And you could detach that mechanical element that's in a game, that's part of the framework that enables you to have fun and compete against people, and take it and transplant it into a digital learning experience that has nothing to do with play and nothing to do with having fun. It could be a very dry, compliance-driven, I don't know, e-learning module about the Data Protection Act, where you read about legal case studies, but then it asks you to navigate various scenarios, saying what would you do in this situation if there was a data protection institute at your employers, and you would score points on the basis of whether you successfully navigated that challenge. There could be nothing fun or play-based around that challenge. It might be multiple choice questions based on legal principles and you following a process, but you would still be scoring points, and that might possibly allow you to be compared to other employees, and you could rank your knowledge in a league table, which again comes from league table, that comes from a sporting game context, but it wouldn't feel like a game in any way. But nevertheless, your specific performance would be quantitatively assessed and then presented back in context to other learners. So it would be that mechanic from a game, but it wouldn't feel like a game. That's one example of a gamification technique, I think.
Yeah, that's fabulous. I think that makes things a lot clearer with the specific examples that you gave. Okay, we've got another one from a gentleman called Tariq. Can you briefly describe the difference between Voctec and Edtech, as they seem to be used interchangeably?
Well, obviously, as someone from UFI, I would be horrified to hear someone use those terms interchangeably, but I fully appreciate that for example, Voctec is probably not as well known a phrase as Edtech. My understanding would be that Edtech will be educational technology, which could be anything from e-learning module to learning management system software and many other things that enable people to learn things. Voctec would be perhaps very similar technology, but it would be for workers and people in the workplace, the employment sector, or people who want to access employment who aren't employed. It's not to do with passing exams, university students, school students who are learning for academic purposes. It's people who are learning for employment, productivity, and workplace purposes.
Yeah, so I'd agree with Daniel there. That the term Voctec comes from vocational technology. So again, what are the differences between normal technology that you use in schools or in colleges, and if it's being used for a vocational use? I think that's the key difference. Are any of the games that you mentioned, and this was about just before 11 o'clock, are any of the games that you mentioned available for download?
Great question, and the answer is that the last time I checked, which was probably last week, yes, some of them are. I think Chomp, C-H-O-M-P, that was certainly available as of a week ago, so I'd be very surprised if it wasn't available now. It was a little buried on the App Store when it was released a couple of weeks ago, but if you wanted to search for in a browser, chomp.fun is the project's website, but it is also available on the Android Play Store. Readable, which was not a game as such, but as I was saying, it had gamification elements. Readable is definitely available I think maybe on both app stores, but if not, just Android, and that's out there now with a new release just coming out. Signs of Life is definitely available too. It's not on the App Store, but if you search for it, and also the project who made it, the company, sorry, are called Desk with a Q, DESQ, and Signs of Life. It's currently available on an NHS website to play there. So that's 3 that I can think of that are definitely available. And National Numeracy, that's National Numeracy of the organisation that made Stardust Studios. Whether that is still available in the same form, I'm not certain, but you can quickly look at their website and they may well have other learning games there, even if that one isn't still available, which it may be.
Excellent, thank you, Daniel. So there's a question from Anne Copens. So I think this is related to the progress that was made from the case study with Chomp, and it's sort of directly related to that. Is the progress different for players in other parts of the world? So I'm assuming that they're obviously trying to compare the progress for Western world players on that game and for people using it elsewhere.
I'm not, sorry, apologies, I'm not 100% sure what the angle of the question is. I think it was, my interpretation of that would be when Chomp used the phrase Western players, they were contrasting them, yes, for example, with players in China. But I don't have much more detail behind that. I think you would probably be safer to say something like what they were told by Candy Crush was based on analysing, player behaviour in the UK and Europe and America and those kind of markets. But they didn't explicitly contrast it with data generated from other markets, as far as I'm aware. It was a what am I trying to say? A fortuitous exchange of practice at a conference, I believe. It was a conference conversation, that kind of thing. It wasn't based on a formal exchange of data or study, but it did shape their approach, and their own piloting of different versions of the game did bear out the fact that it was much more effective when they did it that way. So their own data confirmed the kind of informal guidance they got from a practitioner, but that practitioner from Candy Crush didn't give them detailed access to all of their data.
That's great. I'm just moving along. Do the gamification resources that you've talked about have a cost?
So I'm going to interpret that. So actually, sorry, Manjinder, could you repeat the question?
Do the gamification resources that you have talked about have a cost?
So the gamification resources I talked about were things like points and scoring and narratives and use of character and so on and so forth. Well, no, from the point of view of thinking about how they would be used in your game, writing a game design document, writing a storyboard. If you're doing it internally, the only cost is your time. But I suspect that what the questioner might be meaning is, does it cost me lots of money to build these digitally? And the only honest answer I can give to that is it depends what gamification element you mean and what kind of technical solutions you have at your disposal. If you are an organization that already has, for example, licenses for e-learning software like Articulate Storyline or Rise or other kind of authoring tools, then they do have simple gamification elements within them, and that would be free because you've already got that license cost. If you're starting with a blank sheet of paper and have no digital development tools, then you're going to have to invest in something to produce anything at all. I'm not trying to avoid the question, but I'm trying to say that you can certainly kind of have a lot of creative thinking about how to apply gamification mechanism to your output for free or in terms of internal reflection and research. And if you have existing tools, you might find it's very cost effective or even free to adapt them from the way that you're already using them. I think where the cost comes in probably is if you have to acquire the capacity for functional development that you don't already have, especially if it's very graphically rich and its use of media is expensive. So for example, if you were going to have lots of animated characters that talked and had audio, if that was part of the game design document checklist, media is expensive. Or if you wanted to make something that was very story based, and had a rich use of dialogue, whether or not that was spoken, it could be written on the screen. Again, you might need to get a specialist writer in for that. So the more you have high-end narrative elements, audio, visuals, animations, stories, that might cost you something because many organizations don't have that internal capacity. But if you're going for something which is more straightforward and can be adapted from tools you already use, then the upfront cost might just be the opportunity cost you have of thinking about researching and designing that approach on paper rather than doing something else. I hope that's useful.
So I suppose it just depends on how far you want to go with it, really. I think that clears that. Okay, do you have any best practice tips for applying gamification to an existing learning program, such as leadership development?
I think I would go back, without copping out, I think I would go back to one of the points I made a couple of times, which is it's about user profiling. So I'm going to, with the example given of leadership training, I'm going to make some broad brush assumptions that it's adults, that it might be senior members of an organization who might be somewhat older and might possibly be less likely to play games in their spare time. These are all stereotypes, but I'm just sketching out some assumptions. And if that was the case, then I think your leadership training program would have to take a game-based approach that wouldn't annoy or irritate those learners. If you're delivering it digitally, then sure, people are competitive and they'd like to see how they're doing compared to other people. So that might be that you want to have points and scoring and some kind of way of those leadership candidates saying, oh, this is where I fit in with the kind of cohort, and oh, I want to do better than that, and you want to kind of appeal to their competitive nature. And also, often in leadership training, you have simulations and scenarios and case studies, and making those more gamified in terms of points, scoring, branching situations with feedback, perhaps characters, and making them more simulation based. That might tie in with the nature of the content and the preference of your learners. So if you're doing that through some kind of LMS or with some kind of digital learning resources, you can make that an interactive game based experience. If you're doing it through kind of live sessions, then again you can have kind of not face-to-face, that's the wrong word, but live gaming experiences with case study materials, getting people to kind of break into groups and kind of come up with solutions that you might score and kind of compete against each other. Without knowing how you deliver it, it's kind of hard to say exactly what would work, but I think it has to be something that would resonate with those learners and suit the source content, and probably also be something that you could kind of practically try and do without too much risk if you're not doing it already. So yeah, I would say in that situation, a quick win might be to amp up the game elements of any kind of existing case studies or simulations that you've already got, and make sure that it stays quite serious and kind of adult if those learners are going to be senior in their organizations.
That's fab. Thank you, Daniel. Okay, what are your thoughts on points being used to pay for extrinsic rewards in gamified learning content?
It sounds very much to me like the learner probably knows more about that than I do. But my interpretation of that, when you're saying pay, is in-game purchases. I think that's what was meant. And if it is, then that's something that in a commercial gaming context would be like buying weapons in League of Legends, or buying some kind of power-up in a smartphone game for money. Actual kind of real-world monetization of in-game artifacts and functions and capabilities. And that isn't something that I know anything about. And in fact, that's a really interesting question. I'd be fascinated to know, if that is what's being asked, how that would apply in an adult work-based learning game, and what their motivation would be to pay money for an artifact in a game that is supposed to make them better in the workplace. But for now, I've got to put my hands up and say, if that's the question, I don't have experience of that.
Yeah, it'd be interesting. It's Anthony Williams who's asked that one. If you do have an example to share with us, that'd be great. We'd be very interested in seeing how that might work. There's a couple of questions that I'm going to sort of gather together in one. So there's and it's about sort of recommendations of platforms or technology that you can build games on.
Okay, so very reasonable question, and when I gave the previous webinars on learning design, there were questions of a similar nature, and apologies, I'm not a developer. So with that aside, I would say you'd be very well advised to talk to someone that knows what they're doing, because it's a crowded marketplace. Even as a non-developer, the clients that I work with use a range of tools, and they have, for one thing, a very wide-ranging cost implication to them. So without avoiding the question, I would say focus on the game design document stage of the process, so you've got a very sharp understanding of what your game should do, and then basically have a beauty parade, or if that's not the right term, an audition of various vendors, or I don't know what your budget would be, but know what you actually need before you go out and look for the tool, would be my suggestion. And it might be that you are, again, with budget allowing, well advised to get an industry partner to help you choose. The larger the budget, the more important it is to make the right choice, and the more you might be able to find money in your budget to partner up with someone from one of the agencies we've looked at today, not necessarily to use them, but to get them to be your partner in selecting the right platform, because it'd be quite easy to make not the wrong choice, but it'd be quite easy to be tempted by something that looks very appealing and kind of, what's the word, kind of engaging and entertainment driven, that might not end up matching your training needs, because ultimately what you're doing is a game for training purposes. You're not doing a game for entertainment purposes, but a lot of the time the tools present themselves with the entertainment to the forefront, and it's easy to be misled, I would imagine.
Just leading on from that, and again, there's a couple of questions around this. Are there any free resources that you can go over that might be useful to the audience?
Sorry, same answer. As a non-developer, no, I don't use the tools myself. I'd be very surprised if there weren't a range of free games authoring tools out there, especially for smartphones. They're probably going to be quite basic, and my instinct would be they would be of the model of a bunch of multiple choice questions or questions like that you could edit, and that were presented through a kind of pub quiz or jukebox or game show kind of interface. I've seen those before. So I would be surprised if you couldn't find options like that that were either free or very low cost, but they might be quite rigid. But yeah, but that kind of thing would exist. And I also think probably in this day and age, you can probably get free versions of immersive worlds, if that's the right phrase, software, certain versions of things like Unity, or things that build, first person perspective worlds that you can explore through, interact with people and solve challenges and things. But again, if you don't know how to use those, that might be of limited value. But I think such things, I remember, are out there as well.
Excellent, thank you for that. There's another question here. Can one use gamification for apps? What is the line, if there is any, between an app with game elements and a pure game?
I think it's a similar question to the one that we kicked off with. What's the difference between games and gamification? I think it's in the eye of the beholder. To some extent, there are grey areas, and I think actually in the previous time I did this webinar, someone asked a similar question, which was, I want that person thought that a game would be effective for their learners, but thought the learners would reject it because the learners were from an older age group and they would be suspicious of a game. So to put a kind of, example in that area, that grey area, it might be that you do actually end up making what is a game. It's playable, it's fun, it has all the mechanisms we've talked about, scoring points, it has characters, it has, audio effects and animations and all the rest of it. But you don't call it that because you think the learners wouldn't like it. And it could be just as simple as saying, this learning app will achieve this, that, and the other. It's a toolkit, it's a resource base, and it has various, workplace challenges where you'll get feedback based on your decisions, etc. And it is a game, but you just don't call it that because you don't think it would go down very well. So it can be as simple as that you have a pure game on one end of the spectrum that you say, this is a game with a learning or training function. At the other end of the spectrum, you have a very dry and serious kind of legal e-learning course which actually has mechanics behind it that score people and have league tables and such, but you don't use the word game at all, and it isn't fun and it isn't playable. And then in the middle you might have things which actually you could quite easily say this is a game because it has a more kind of high media entertainment feel to it, Or you could actually say actually about exactly the same thing. No, it isn't a game. It's a serious grown-up learning interactive resource with personalized scenarios. But actually, it looks and feels just the same as this other thing which you present as a game. So I think I'm being slightly confusing, but I think it is ultimately judged by the people that use it. So it's probably just as much a matter of thinking how you need to position it with them and what's going to work, as distinct from what it actually is. Perception is probably as important as underlying functionality here. What's going to be accepted by the people who need to use it. And sometimes you won't call it a game, or even though it is, or you might amp up the game elements, even though it's a bit dry, because you think they'll be interested.
Absolutely, and I'd really agree with you there, Daniel. I remember when we first did this for an internal webinar, and you asked me if I played games, and I was like, no, I don't play any games. And then when I really thought about it, that there are lots of gamification elements to some of the apps that I use and some of the digital products that I use. So yeah, and again, looking at that user it's what it comes down to. And how they get
That's a really good point, Manjinder. I think gamification, maybe gamification is the wrong word. Maybe we need a third word that has game in it. But game culture has permeated our wider culture to quite a large extent in the digital era. There've always been games, Monopoly and card games and such things. But as so much life is digital and screen-based now, I think game thinking and game skins, the way things look, like Netflix or Amazon, all of us probably have home TV packages like those. If you look at those menu screens, if you'd shown that to somebody 15 years ago, they would have assumed it was a computer game, probably instantly, because it just looks like one. It looks like, oh, I'm going to choose this character. What profile are you logging on as to access Netflix today? It has your name on it. It has what you've just watched. It's not points and stuff, but it kind of presents its content options in a kind of results table. It has animations to it. It has all these enticing media elements. So the line is quite grey.
Absolutely, absolutely. Right, Daniel, I'm going to invite Sarah, because Sarah is in the background somewhere. I've just looked at, and I'm going to invite Sarah, if you're still there, Sarah, to come and talk about UFI's role broadly, because there's a couple of questions around that, and then are you there, Sarah?
I am here. Can you hear me?
Fabulous, fabulous. And then I'll leave the wrap up to you as well.
Okay, that's fine. Thanks, Manjinder. Thanks, Dan, for a brilliant presentation. There was just a question about what UFI's role in all of this is. That's a question from Tariq, and I don't want to spend too much time on this because we're all here for a presentation on gamification, but just to say that what UFI's role is what we try and do is improve the delivery of vocational skills in the UK, because we all need better skills. And by vocational skills, we mean adult skills for the workplace. And we do that in a number of different ways. So one of the things we're best known for is that we are a funder, and we fund digital learning projects through various funding rounds. And if you sign up for our newsletter, we will always let you know when a new funding round is open. And then so we fund projects, and what's more, we also disseminate then the learning and the information that we get as a result of these, and the how-to webinars are just part of that strand of work, in order to get more people taking up digital learning opportunities, and for employers to realize how digital to make a great big difference to the skills that they can provide for their learners, and for learners to get more opportunities to gain more skills. That's a very quick gallop through. Manjinder, are there any more questions outstanding for Dan in the questions box?
No, there's no further questions. I have collated a couple of them and tried to ask them in one question rather than lots of separate, and repeating questions. But there is a lot of compliments and a lot of people thanking us for the webinar and how clear it is. And so thank you everybody for joining and all those lovely comments.
Yeah, thank you everybody for being here. Thanks very much, Dan. Just to
You're
say,
welcome.
great webinar. We will be sending out a link to the recording of this webinar and to the slides. Everything will be available on the UFI how to webinar page. If you haven't already, sign up for our newsletter at www.ufi.co.uk/contact, so you to get all the information about upcoming webinars and other opportunities to go for funding. There'll be a repeat of this webinar next Wednesday, and we'll also be letting you know about future webinars as well. So thanks very much all. Thanks a lot. Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.